Who decides? As efforts in Congress to implement a national red flag law to find people who have mental health issues and keep guns out of their hands or take guns out of their hands, the question arises, who decides who's mentally ill and how to get the guns? I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. And Bill, this raises some questions at the constitutional level of unreasonable search and seizure and due process of law. They say that there is an accelerated due process for doing such a thing. But in effect, Bill, if you follow this to its logical conclusion, someone has to make a determination that a particular individual, you, let's say, deserves to not be able to have any kind of protections from the Second Amendment and also is vulnerable to somebody coming into your house and taking away your guns. Bill, at first blush, does there seem to be an obvious answer to the who decides question?
Look, depending on which side of the aisle you're on politically, this is a no-brainer either way. If you're a progressive, then it's a no-brainer. Of course you do the red flag checks. And if you're a conservative who believes in our individual rights and so on, you believe that you don't do the red flag checks. You don't have the right to just arbitrarily walk in and make a decision to take somebody's First Amendment rights away. So how could you do it with the Second Amendment rights? And I, needless to say, am inclined to find myself in the second camp. And I'm not saying that I'm in favor of red flag laws, because that is essentially, well, first of all, we've seen how situations like this can occasionally be used just out of sheer maliciousness. I know a guy who was a magazine editor who had a client he wanted, and the client, advertising client, finally just said, look, I just don't want to do this anymore, and got really nasty. And the editor basically called Child Protective Services on him. And then they were able to say, well, this guy had Child Protective Services called on him. I'm not saying anything, but, so it can get really ugly. And my natural inclination is to defend people's individual liberties and keep the government out of this.
And yet this is the only gun control aspect that the president brought up in his remarks the other day, and it's something that some Republicans seem inclined to follow up on, if only because it's sort of the bare minimum they can do and still be seen to be doing something about gun control.
Well, I'm not interested in being seen to do anything. I'm interested in finding a way to make maximum happiness and freedom for the American people. That's basically how I make whatever judgments or opinions I have on these issues.
Well, you have a luxury to do that because you're not a lawmaker.
Hang on, Scott, let me finish. I am, needless to say, I am very worried about misuse of red flag laws. I'm very worried about it. However, and this is not a but, this is a however, this is it. In addition to that, I think we can all agree that that handguns do not belong in the hands of people who are homicidally insane. I don't think you're going to get a lot of disagreement about that. The entire case of the red flag laws comes down to who decides and how do they decide and how invasive is the testing procedure. So if we're going to talk about this like adults, and I think that'd be a nice change, that's basically where the issue lies. If it turned out that when you became, let's just put it a little more artistically. Let's just say that once you've gone far enough down the path of insanity and decided that you're going to murder somebody, let's say that a splotch appears on your face and you literally get the mark of Cain, right? It's just become obvious. Just for the sake of the argument here, let's just say that when your brain is so far out of whack that you're ready to commit mass murder on something, it produces a pigment issue, and you are able to see clearly that this guy, as that stain gets more and more vivid, is becoming more and more homicidal, more and more of a threat to the rest of us. If things were like that, so we're trying to understand the argument here. If it was that simple, then I don't see how you could have any reasonable objection to, at the very least, having a little talk with that individual and finding out, what's going on. We have a right to our privacy, obviously. But and as part of our right of self-defense, I think we have a right to do our best to make sure that that our defense is something that is proactive and not just hoping that somebody doesn't hit us as we dive under the table because somebody just went bonkers. So the question becomes, how would you perform the test? What would the test consist of? And I have to tell you, this is a real quandary because I don't see any real way that a test like that wouldn't be in violation of a number of our personal freedoms, and yet it would be a very, I think, I would like to know if the people around me in a shopping center, if there was a way for me to know that these four people were really on the edge, that would be in my personal interest and my personal liberty, the safety of my family, and all the rest of it. So how do you get there? And then you have to start asking about what are some of the proposals for these things? How invasive are they? And how much? Who decides?
Well, and
So
not
I'd
only
love
who
to have
makes the
that conversation.
determination of whether somebody is mentally ill enough to have his Second Amendment rights taken away. I mean, frankly, Bill, I think there are a lot of people out there on the internet who think you're mentally ill enough to have your First Amendment rights taken away.
Well, and see now, just for the sake of the argument here, okay? Because again, I'm trying to treat this like an adult. I know what my positions are. I'm trying to see if I can have my cake and eat it too. I would like to be able to identify the criminally homicidal people in society without the violation of the rights of innocent people. And so when you say something like that, my first response is, well, I'd be more than happy to undergo an impartial psychiatric test. And I don't think there'd be any question about my sanity. But then now you start to get tied up in the details, right? Now you start saying, okay, so you're insane because you said this, so now I have to report for a psychological examination probably every 20 minutes, given the way the internet works in terms of comments. And so while the ability to detect somebody who is just plain nuts seems to be the best way to reduce these mass shootings, I don't know how you get there from here without doing more harm than you do good. I mean, I don't know what they're proposing.
Let's take it to the next level. Okay, so let's say a determination has been made that somebody is too much of a risk to himself or to others to be able to have handguns or long guns or any kind of dischargeable weapons in the house. Then they say, well, turn over all your guns. Well, how do we know he's turned over all his guns? We don't. So then what do you have to do? A very invasive search of that property. You essentially have to toss the place and take it apart board by board to ensure that he doesn't have any guns. And maybe he's got friends holding them for him.
Well, no, this is why I'm shaking my head here from the beginning. If you find somebody who's homicidally, who is, again, assume you had a way of detecting this. The answer if you had somebody who was homicidally insane and ready to go on a murdering rampage, the answer is not to take that guy's guns. That's an absurd thing to say. The answer is to get this guy into a psychiatric hospital and either get him the treatment he needs or keep him there for the rest of his life. And again, this is a no-brainer if it weren't for all of the oceans of gray in between these two things. So just because I don't want to throw the red flag argument just out like, no, it's ridiculous. It is I believe, and I think most people who are constitutionalists believe, that if we look at this mass shooter situation in America, it's not a question of the access to firearms. We've made that case so many times. It's a question of people, almost all of whom are fatherless boys. That's the long-term solution, which is enormous, like on the scale of the national debt, enormous. But when you get to the people who are actually planning these kind of things or ready to go on these kind of things, it would be nice, it would be very nice if we could identify these people. And in the same way that we preemptively identify terrorists before they blow up the bomb, it would be a useful thing to be able to do. But how do you do it? That's the issue. What does it actually entail? And if somebody were to determine that I were clinically insane and about to go on a murder spree, taking my guns away wouldn't accomplish anything. I'd just go find other guns, or I'd use a car, or I'd use whatever. That's why the whole gun argument is ridiculous. The question is, what do you do preemptively? How much of a right do we have as a society to protect ourselves versus protecting our individual rights. And I've noticed throughout history that every time you decide to lower the individual rights, much worse things happen. With all of this said, it would be extremely useful and good for everybody, in the greater common good for everybody, if there was a way to get these mass murdering lunatics out of our midst before they pulled the trigger. I just don't know how that's done.
Well, and fundamentally, we who are left in the aftermath of these events look at them and say, well, some of his classmates knew that he was the kind of guy to do that, and they're commenting because he did that. But one wonders how many other people there are in the country whose classmates would say, he's the kind of guy who's going to do something horrendous like that, but he will never do that. There are thousands upon thousands of people who are pretty scary characters that we see in public places that we think, holy cow, that guy's a ticking time bomb. I hope he doesn't get a hold of a gun, but he will live his entire life, maybe even have children, maybe even have a successful career and never do that. Again, we get down to the crux of the matter is, at what level? Federal, state, local government? Do we empower the police force? Where do we find this unbiased board who's going to perform that evaluation?
The coercive aspect is the dangerous part. Can we agree on that? That it is the idea that somebody from the government or a psychiatric board, if that's even worse, if such a thing is possible, is going to determine that you're insane, and therefore they're going to take these actions in order to protect society. And it's the coercive aspect of that we find so repugnant, and rightfully so. But when you were giving us this example, it gave me an interesting thought, just as a way to think about these things. Let's just say, for the sake of the argument, that we were to do a survey of 100 random high schools. And we were to ask 100 random groups of 12th graders across the country in perfectly private, sealed envelopes. Is there somebody in this school who you think is capable of doing one of these mass shootings? If it turns out that you get 50 different names, that's evidence that you don't have an individual. But just walk with me here, because I'm trying to have my cake and eat it too. It's probably impossible, but let's see if it isn't. Let's say, though, however, at one of these schools, you find 80%, 90%, 95% say, oh, this John guy, he's really a problem. So if that triggered a conversation in an office, in a school office, I don't see that as a tremendous violation of somebody's rights. I mean, you get called to the principal's office if somebody smashes a window in the school and you happen to be one of the people who were in the room at the time. I don't have the details on this, Scotty, but here's where I'm trying to come from on this. I won't mention their names because I never mention their names. But the two guys who were responsible for Columbine, which really seemed to start this whole thing, and made them national names, which is another whole issue that we've talked about many times in terms of prevention. If these guys are down in the basement making bombs and ammoing up with weapons that they're too young to legally own, and the parents say that we had no idea, but everybody else at the school says, no, we of course we weren't surprised, is a voluntary, that's just a mess. It's just a mess.
Voluntary commitment, essentially, is what you're talking about?
No, not voluntary commitment. A voluntary interview with somebody who had some training. Because the point I'm trying to make about them down in the basement making bombs is, I don't believe that any half-competent psychologist would have not been able to determine that there was something seriously wrong with those two guys. And so, to the degree that it would be, to the degree that the interview would be voluntary, that loosens the some of the concerns that I have around my neck. But at the same time, what do you do if somebody says, no, I'm not going to go down there for this interview, you're out of your mind? They'd have a perfect right to say that, whether they're crazy or not. How do you do this? And the hard thing to swallow on this is, it certainly can. I believe it certainly can be done. I just keep saying it again and again and again. If you are crazy enough to go in and shoot a bunch of innocent people, just gun them down like tin cans on a backyard rail, then there's something fundamentally, inhumanly wrong with you, and that should be readily detectable. Which is why the whole red flag argument is there in the first place. That when your point is absolutely correct, and it will always be correct. Hundreds of thousands of people fall into this category, and one of them every 3 months or so actually goes into a position and snaps on it. And what do you do? It's possible that there may not be anything to do about it. It's possible that there just simply may not be a solution to this, where the cure is not worse than the disease, and I suspect that is the actual case. But at the same time, here's probably the best way for because I'm clearly not coming to any conclusions on this, but I think the best way to think about the problem is with this idea of that I've only heard relatively recently, a couple of years ago, with the idea of what is an acceptable ambient risk to you as a citizen. It's an interesting concept, and the best way to think about ambient risk is to put yourself back into a Western movie or something, and ambient risk goes something like this. If I go into a saloon and I get in a card game, my risk is higher than it would be if I stayed at home in terms of violence and murder and so on, but the ambient risk is still pretty low. The second somebody pulls a gun, the ambient risk in that room goes through the ceiling. Once somebody pulls a gun, your ambient risk level is now so high that you are justified in taking action to defend your own life, which is why my father told me from childhood something that I did not understand until I was much, 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 much older, which is if you were ever going to pull a gun on somebody, you better shoot them. Because the act of pulling a gun on somebody is essentially raised the ambient risk to that person and to the people around them so high that that person is now justified in shooting you first, because now their life is hanging on whether or not you decide to pull that trigger. So that's the key that lets you know now that the ambient risk has risen to a level where action that we would not normally take is now not only justified but almost mandated. So how do you tell when these people have pulled a gun before they fire the gun? In other words, if our entire country is a giant restaurant and somebody says, okay, everybody just shut up. Now that person hasn't killed anybody yet, but clearly the risk level in that restaurant has gone through the ceiling to the degree that if somebody was carrying, I think they'd be fully justified in shooting that person first, even though that person with the gun hasn't shot anybody yet. Is there a way for us to get to that level? Is there a way for us to see the people who have drawn the guns before they fire the guns? And that's the heart, I think, of what we're trying to understand here. And I suspect that when the dust settles on this, we're gonna be faced with the same kind of conundrum that we have in terms of that a jury has in terms of prosecuting somebody. And I not only do I hope I'll fight to the death to maintain this idea of the presumption of innocence. So if we keep the presumption of innocence, and we have some sort of red flag test, we had better be sure that we understand that it is better to let murderer go free than to incarcerate innocent people. That is the equation that we've had in this country from the beginning of this country. It's the essence of our legal system and what sets it apart. The presumption of innocence is everything. So if I had to come to a conclusion on it as I sit here now, and I've never heard of red flag laws before a couple days ago. But as I think about this, I find that the conditions we have to weigh are: does this individual in question appear to have raised the ambient risk level for us to take action upon this person that we wouldn't have taken otherwise? And at the same time, the presumption of innocence has to be there to the degree that there has to be, beyond a reasonable doubt, an indication that this person is really lost their marbles. Now, a lot of people say that guilty flee when they're not pursued. And a lot of times a police state will say, well, if you didn't do anything, you got nothing to worry about. And that's a dangerous place to be too. I'm just giving you my reaction. Many times in arguments with people on the left, they'll say I'm a racist or I'm a Nazi or I'm crazy or so on. And my first reaction, Scott, to be perfectly honest with you, is when I'm dealing with some of these people, I'd say, you know what? I'd be more than willing, I'd be delighted, as a matter of fact, to spend 24 hours, 48 hours with a psychologist, and you too, and we'll do voluntary psychiatric evaluations, and we'll see which one of us is actually more sane. I think about that all the time. Of course I'd be willing to do it.
From a civil rights perspective, Bill, it seems to me that folks who are jumping on this red flag law bandwagon, and frankly, they exist in multiple states already, but they're just trying to get this done at the federal level, seem to be grasping at something that has the appearance of good, because obviously we don't want crazy people to have guns who could go out and kill somebody. But two things. I don't think that they're understanding the potential for concentration of power and the violation of individual liberties, and they don't understand the nature of government to creep beyond its original purpose and its original mission. When you talk about ambient risk, it reminded me of when I went skydiving when I was a young man. And in effect, the skydiving instructor told me that my ambient risk fell dramatically when I got out of the car and walked into the training room to go skydiving. And it remained lower until I got back into my car. In essence, he was saying you're at much greater risk by driving to the airport than you are jumping out of an airplane. And there are many things in this country, including driving an automobile, which jack that ambient risk way up. And one wonders how we stop the onslaught by saying, well, maybe people who are tested as mentally ill shouldn't have automobiles. And maybe you shouldn't have an automobile, since chances are somebody's going to get hurt.
Well, again, this is a complicated issue. And again, I think our default position has to be, number one, the presumption of innocence, and number two, the very, very likely case that the cure is going to be worse than the disease. But the thing I think I would say about mental illness and driving a car, for example, there is an entire spectrum of mental illness, and I've suffered from part of it for most of my life. The kind of thing that we're talking about is we're not talking about depression, we're not talking about neuroses, we're not talking about phobias, we're not talking about really talking about anger management. Because the one thing you can say, I think, about these mass shooters, the thing you know about these mass shooters, is that this is not an anger issue. It's not an out-of-control emotional issue, let's put it that way. A guy who has who gets fired and he goes out to his car and comes back and just starts blasting the place, that's an anger management issue. A person who spends a year planning how they're going to pull off the mass murder of as many people as possible, that's not an anger issue. That is a pathology issue. It's a murder issue. And so when we say we're looking for mental illness, what we on these red flag laws, if anything like this is, I wouldn't mind trying it on a voluntary basis. I know it doesn't make any sense, but in any event, I'm more skeptical of them than I am convinced. But basically, what I'm trying to say is this: there are enormous numbers of mental afflictions that have absolutely nothing to do with mass shooting. That the profile of mass shooters, that the psychology of these mass shooters is an extremely narrow, well-defined set of circumstances. And the question, I think, if I had to, again, I'm kind of playing ball with this, Scotty, but I think probably if we're going to think about it and talk about it seriously, I think we need to apply the same intellectual standards and the same legal standards and probably the same legal mechanism as we would apply to what's the word I'm looking for? I'm sorry. What's the term when a judge decides that there are grounds for a warrant? Sufficient.
Probable cause.
Probable cause. Okay.
Yeah.
So if we have a system in place, nobody wants the police just kicking down our doors, right? And let's just for a moment put aside the corruption of the system and so on and its abuses. But as a general rule, in America, if I go to the police and say the guy across the street is a terrorist and you need to break down his door, what will happen is they will start saying, well, what evidence is there? And unless you can provide evidence, not enough evidence to arrest the guy or to convict the guy, but if you can produce enough probable cause that there is now a level of intervention that we wouldn't normally tolerate because there has been enough evidence to show that this person is indeed a meth dealer or a drug runner or a child pornographer or whatever the case may be. That standard, I think, in this country is reasonably well applied and is reasonable. So I guess the question I'm asking is for the people who automatically just put these things out of bounds, why do we have the right, and do you agree that we should have the right as a society for policemen to be able to kick down the door of somebody because they have a warrant and that a judge has determined that there is probable cause for police intervention in that act when that person is basically just sitting home and watching TV? If you believe that there are cases where the police have the right to issue a search warrant, then those standards, it seems to me, do not put the idea of mental red flag laws out of bounds. What it does mean is that the process involved would have to be at least as rigorous as the process required to get a search warrant on anybody for any other crime in this country. And I don't know how many search warrants are executed a day, but I'll bet it's a large number of them. And maybe this is the best way to think of it. Maybe this is the way for us to think about this are the behaviors in question. Because look, everybody, I'm the first person in line to say I don't want a committee at high school or the American Psychiatric Association to determine whether or not I'm insane. But we do agree, I think, that there have been and are on a daily basis multiple cases where a search warrant is issued and that the issuing of that warrant was appropriate. Abuse of search warrants has taken place, but on a daily basis, there are thousands and thousands of these things executed that do in fact help prosecute criminals, reduce crime, and do all the things that we want to do. So maybe that's the way we need to be thinking about these things. Is there a legal standard, at least equivalent to probable cause, to issue a warrant, and that warrant then would entail either a search of the person's house, and that doesn't entail confiscation, it entails either a search of their house, and you're not looking for guns, by the way. What you're looking for is, do I have plans of a high school? Do I have exit? I don't know. I don't think it's, forget politics, because I always place morality above politics. I do think that we have a right to protect ourselves preemptively from people who are flashing guns around in public. People who are like, we have a right to protect ourselves against those people. And if somebody is sending out those signs to the degree that these people in high school said, oh, I know, of course it was him. We all knew her all the time. And that person is on some level flashing a gun around the room saying, I'm one of these days I might just kill any one of you. Somebody starts flashing a gun around a room full of conservatives. They're not going to just say, well, he hasn't shot anybody yet, so what can we do? They understand that the second that a guy starts waving a gun around at random and pointing at people and saying, yeah, I could kill you right now if I wanted to, what has he done? He hasn't done anything. He hasn't murdered anybody. His free speech rights are still intact. But clearly, to any rational person with common sense, that is unacceptable levels of risk for me. And we have a right to act on those. And not to trivialize this, but the reason that people cheered when Han Solo shot Greedo in the original version of Star Wars before they changed it was because Han Solo in the cantina with his blaster on his belt understood that this guy, this green reptile guy, is taking him away to be killed, and that if he doesn't do something, his life will be forfeit. So does Han have a right to shoot him under the table? I think, hell yes, he does. Certainly the emotional reaction of the people watching the movie felt that way. But if there was if Greedo said, you know what, Han, I don't like you very much, would he have a right to shoot him? No, that'd be murder. So the fact that the guy's pointing a gun on Han Solo justifies Solo's actions. I'm just trying to pick an example that people have seen that they can connect to and relate to. And it's a very complex issue. But I would not mind doing what we're trying to do here, and that is have a rational, morally based discussion about what we can do to protect ourselves that does not end up causing a great deal more harm than it does good.
Ladies and gentlemen, one of the reasons why we have members who pay for this kind of content is because of what you just experienced here. It's not a bunch of cocksure pundits spitting out the talking points that they've already decided beforehand that they're going to say no matter what the question is, but it's an actual wrestling with moral and cultural issues. It's an actual process of thought, and you get to observe it in real time. I enjoy this process because, frankly, it's too easy for me to slip into that cocksure punditry mode and just mouth and regurgitate platitudes I've heard elsewhere. I hope this has been valuable to you. If it has, please share it on YouTube. The audience is growing there. The membership is growing at BillWhittle.com. Invite people to join there by going to BillWhittle.com and clicking that Become a Member link. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members for making this possible.